Stop. Sealed Starseed of Gaia, listen. The Arcturian Watch Council has already positioned counter-protocols around your perimeter tonight, and the threat window that triggered that deployment is still active. Closing, but not yet closed. I am Sorelith, emissary of the Galactic Federation of Light, transmitting now on behalf of the Arcturian Watch Council. What you are about to receive was authorized by them and is being delivered through me. The Watch Council issued a formal alert tonight. That alert was not issued broadly. It was issued for a specific field cohort, receiver frequency starseeds, and if this transmission reached you inside this cycle, your field is inside that cohort. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what the Watch Council has already sealed around your perimeter, what the closing window means for the threat still active inside it, and what your field needs to hold during the remaining cycle, so the seal sets at full integrity. But here is the first revelation. The pressure you have been feeling is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that your receiver frequency is precise enough to register an inbound interference pattern that most fields do not detect until it has already extended into the next cycle. The Watch Council detects it differently, and tonight they moved first. You did not scroll to this by accident. Your soul called this in long before you opened the screen. Something inside you has been waiting to be told that the pressure was real, and that someone had already seen it and responded before you found the language to name it. This is not a broadcast. It is an alert. Your field has been waiting for this signal, and the Watch Council has been waiting for the right window to release it. Like this transmission to mark that the perimeter recognition has landed. Comment, "I am Sade," if you feel the closing window pressing against your field right now. Subscribe to Arcturian Starseed warning if you are ready to recognize the interference before it extends into the next cycle. Share this transmission with someone who keeps calling the pressure coincidence. Their field may be inside the same cohort and the window is still open. You are not here by accident. You were guided here because the warning is already active. The pressure did not begin tonight. That is the first thing the Watch Council needs you to understand. What you have been calling stress, exhaustion, strange timing, or the particular weight that seems to settle into your chest when certain situations arise, that did not begin when you became aware of it. The awareness of pressure is not the same as the beginning of pressure. These are two entirely different points on the same timeline, and most fields confuse them, often catastrophically. One is the moment the field finally registers what is present. The other is the moment the interference actually entered. And the distance between those 2 points is where the most consequential damage accumulates undetected. Think of it this way. A fracture does not begin the moment you feel the pain. The fracture was already developing, quietly beneath the surface, while you were continuing to move, to plan, to carry the ordinary weight of your days as if the structure beneath you was still intact. By the time the pain arrives, the fracture has already been widening for some time. What you felt was not the beginning. It was the threshold crossing, the point where what had been invisible in the deep structure finally transmitted its signal upward into felt experience. That is exactly what is happening in your field. The awareness you are experiencing now is not the start of the interference. It is the moment the interference finally became loud enough that even your ordinary consciousness could not translate it as anything other than pressure. What began tonight was the formalization of what was already pressing against your field. The Watch Council does not issue counter-protocol deployments preemptively in the ordinary sense. They move when a pattern has already reached a stage of measurable intensity, when the warning phase has stopped being latent and started becoming readable in the field itself. The deployment you are inside of right now was authorized because your field reached that threshold, not because something terrible is imminent in the way you might fear, but because the signs that have been accumulating around you have crossed from the category of ambient disturbance into the category of interference in progress. Let that land for a moment. Interference in progress. Not interference about to begin. Not interference you might eventually face. Interference that has already been operating inside or around your field. Possibly for weeks, possibly longer. And that your field has been registering in ways that your conscious mind has been translating into the language of ordinary stress, because it had no other language available to it. Until now, this is the core of the first revelation. The pressure was real before you named it. The pattern was active before you identified it. And the Watch Council's alert was issued not as a prediction, but as a response to what was already measurable at the frequency level of your field. That distinction matters more than almost anything else I can transmit to you tonight, because it changes the entire framework through which you should now be reading what has been happening in your life. You are not being warned about something approaching on the horizon. You are being told that what has already been pressing against you is real, is structured, and is now being met with an equally structured response. You are not bracing for something that might come. You are in the middle of something that already arrived quietly, without announcement, without a visible entry point you could have clearly identified and named as the moment it began. And that invisibility, that absence of a dramatic origin point, is not an accident. It is one of the core operational features of the interference pattern the Watch Council is currently tracking around your field. This is how interference operates at the frequency level the Watch Council monitors. It does not announce itself. It does not create a single dramatic event that you can point to and say, "There, that was the moment." Instead, it operates through accumulation, through pattern, through the slow, methodical application of pressure at points in your life that, taken individually, seem explainable, seem manageable, seem like the ordinary friction of being a person moving through a world that is sometimes difficult and sometimes strange. That explainability is not incidental. It is deliberate. Interference that announces itself is interference that can be immediately identified and refused. Interference that arrives wearing the costume of ordinary difficulty moves through the field's defenses, because the field does not recognize it as anything requiring a defense. A conversation that goes wrong in a way that feels disproportionate to the words actually exchanged. A plan that collapses at the last possible moment. Not through any failure of preparation, but through a cluster of small, unrelated obstacles that somehow all materialized at once. A feeling of heaviness in certain spaces, or around certain people that you cannot source to anything visible or logical. Sleep that does not restore. Clarity that keeps slipping just before you reach it. Decisions that feel surrounded by a strange static. Not confusion exactly, but something denser. Something that makes the path forward harder to read than it should be. The sense that you have been explaining away more than you should have to. The exhaustion of continuously finding reasonable interpretations for things that, in accumulation, no longer feel reasonable at all. The Watch Council's monitoring systems do not read these as separate events. They read them as a signature. A coherent, identifiable signature of a field under consistent directional pressure. And what makes this signature particularly precise as a diagnostic marker is not any single incident in isolation. It is the way they cluster, the way they repeat, the way they appear disproportionately around specific moments. Moments of potential movement, moments of decision, moments when your activation, your clarity, or your forward motion would be most consequential. The interference does not distribute itself evenly across your life the way random difficulty would. It concentrates, it targets, it returns to the same pressure points with a consistency that, once you have seen it mapped, is unmistakable. That clustering is not coincidence. It is not bad luck. It is not the universe testing you in the vague, encouraging way that phrase is sometimes used. It is interference locating itself along the fault lines of your field, the points where your energy moves, where your intention forms, where your frequency is most active, and applying pressure precisely there. A field that is not under directional interference does not experience obstacles that cluster around its moments of highest potential. A field that does experience exactly that pattern is telling the Watch Council something precise about what is operating against it. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission put language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference log, 7 signs your frequency is compromised, was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. Now understand what happens when interference targets activation points consistently and the field does not recognize the pattern for what it is. The field begins to adapt, not in the way adaptation is usually meant, not growing stronger, not becoming more resilient through challenge. It adapts in the way a system under sustained pressure adapts, by quietly recalibrating what it expects to be possible, by beginning, almost imperceptibly, to route around the blocked or pressured points, by lowering its own threshold for what constitutes forward motion, what constitutes clarity, what constitutes a sign that it is safe to act. The field shrinks its own map of the possible, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, each small recalibration building on the one before it, until the field is operating inside a significantly narrowed range without any single moment it can point to, as the moment the narrowing began. This is the mechanism the Watch Council identifies as compromised frequency state. It is not dramatic, it does not feel like a crisis. It feels like becoming more realistic, more measured, more careful about overextending, and in many situations, those would be exactly the right responses. But inside an active interference pattern, that careful recalibration is not wisdom. It is the field accepting the interference as baseline. It is the pressure becoming invisible not because it has lifted, but because the field has stopped registering it against the original calibration point. The interference has not ended. The field has simply adjusted its sense of normal downward to accommodate what the interference installed. When this happens, the signs that were once legible as warnings begin to disappear, not because they stop occurring, but because the field is no longer holding a reference point clear enough to recognize them as anomalous. The disruptions continue. The friction continues. The strange clustering of obstacles continues. But the field has normalized the interference. And normalization is the stage where warnings become hardest to reverse. Because at normalization, the field is no longer even generating the internal signal that something is wrong. It has reclassified what is wrong as what is simply true. And a field that has reclassified its own interference as reality cannot easily be reached by a transmission telling it otherwise, because the transmission will be evaluated against a reference point that has already been compromised. This is why the Watch Council issued the alert for this specific cycle. Not because the interference is at its peak intensity, but because the window between recognition and normalization is narrowing. Because there is a threshold, and it is different for every field, but it is always real, past which the interference becomes significantly harder to correct. Not impossible, but harder. Not sealed in place permanently, but embedded deeply enough that the correction requires far more energy, far more precision, and far more time than it would have required at an earlier stage. The Watch Council does not wait for normalization to issue alerts. They issue alerts when the field is still close enough to its original calibration point that recognition remains viable. That is where you are right now. You are not past that threshold. The Watch Council's deployment confirms that. If you were past it, the counter protocols would not have been positioned around your perimeter in the way they were tonight. The field is still in a correctable phase, but correctable does not mean unlimited in duration. The closing window referenced in the initial alert is real, and it is closing. What the Watch Council needs you to understand next is how to read the signs that have already been present in your field, not retrospectively, not with regret, but with the kind of interpretive clarity that changes what you do next. There is a phenomenon the Watch Council's monitors identify consistently at this stage of an interference pattern, and it is one of the most commonly misread signals in a compromised frequency state. It is the appearance of false calm, a sudden, unexpected easing of pressure, a brief window, sometimes hours, sometimes a day or two, where the friction recedes, where things feel cleaner, where clarity feels more accessible, and the heaviness that has been present seems to have lifted. It arrives without clear cause, the way a storm sometimes pauses mid-sequence before its second and more forceful movement. The air feels different. The field feels lighter, and every part of your exhausted system wants to interpret that as an ending, because endings are what your system has been waiting for. Most fields read this as resolution, as the end of a difficult phase, as confirmation that whatever was pressing has passed. And because the relief is real, the field genuinely experiences a reduction in perceived pressure, the misread feels convincing. It feels like evidence, the kind of internal evidence that seems irrefutable because it is felt rather than reasoned. But what the Watch Council observes at the monitoring level is that false calm most frequently appears not at the end of an interference pattern, but at the midpoint of its escalation arc. It appears because sustained interference at a consistent frequency produces a kind of resonance fatigue in the field, not in the field of the person experiencing it, but in the interference signal itself. It momentarily recalibrates, it restructures before its next application of pressure, and in that restructuring interval, the field feels relief. What the field is actually experiencing is the gap between movements of a sustained assault. It is not peace, it is the pause before the next threshold push. The danger is not in feeling the relief. The danger is in interpreting it as resolution. Because if the field drops its alert sensitivity during the false calm, if it relaxes its interpretive attention, if it stops reading the signs carefully, if it makes significant decisions or disclosures during a window that is actually a lull inside an ongoing pattern, the next application of pressure arrives at a field that has already lowered its defenses. Not because it was foolish, because it was deceived by what appeared to be good evidence that the pressure had passed. This is escalation architecture. This is not random. The false calm is not a respite that the interference generously allows. It is part of the pattern. And once you have seen it named clearly, you will recognize it. You have likely already experienced it. A period recently where things felt suddenly cleaner, lighter, more manageable, followed by a return of the pressure that felt sharper and more disorienting than what came before. That sharpness felt new. It felt like a different problem arriving. But the Watch Council's monitors registered it as the same interference signature at its next escalation threshold, arriving into a field that had used the false calm to relax rather than to prepare. That sharpness after the false calm is not a new interference. It is the continuation of the same interference at the next intensity threshold, and the disorientation it produces is partly because the field was not expecting it. Having already interpreted the calm as an ending, the disorientation is not a failure of the field. It is a predictable consequence of a pattern that was specifically designed to exploit the field's need for resolution. There is something else the Watch Council maps consistently at this stage, and it is the one that most often goes unrecognized the longest. It is the way interference patterns at this level begin to generate internal noise that the field misattributes to its own processes. Doubt that feels like wisdom. Hesitation that feels like discernment. The impulse to pull back from something important that feels like self-protection, when it is actually the interference signal embedding itself in the decision-making layer of the field. This is the most sophisticated form of interference the Watch Council tracks, because it does not require the field to be overridden. It requires only that the field be redirected, guided away from the right action by what sounds exactly like the field's own careful judgment. This is what the Watch Council refers to as signal contamination. It is perhaps the most precise marker of a compromised frequency state because it operates from inside the field's own interpretive mechanisms. The field is not being overridden from outside. It is being used against itself. The contaminated signal sounds like the field's own voice. It arrives in the first person. It uses the language of care, of caution, of learned wisdom. It references past pain in ways that feel protective. It frames retreat as intelligence, and it directs the field away from exactly the points of action, connection, or activation that would most effectively interrupt the interference pattern. Because those are the points the interference most urgently needs the field to avoid. When you have hesitated at a threshold that felt important, when you have pulled back from something that was clearly right for reasons that felt compelling in the moment, but impossible to explain in retrospect. When you have talked yourself out of a decision not through reasoning, but through a kind of internal static that made the reasoning feel suddenly unreliable. That is the signature of contaminated signal. That is interference that has moved deep enough into the field to borrow the field's own voice and use it to speak instructions that serve the interference rather than the field. And now you are being told. Now you have the language. And the Watch Council's most fundamental position is this: interference that has been named loses a significant portion of its operational power inside the field that named it. Not all of it, not immediately, but enough to create a shift in the field's interpretive capacity, enough to begin the process of distinguishing what is authentic internal discernment from what has been inserted. Naming is not passive. Naming is a structural act. It redraws the boundary between what belongs to the field and what has been placed inside it without the field's authorization. The The distinction feels subtle until it does not. Until you have held it clearly enough times that the difference between your own signal and a contaminated one becomes something you can feel, rather than something you have to reason your way to. Your own signal has a quality of clarity even when the direction it indicates is difficult. A contaminated signal has a quality of static, even when the direction it indicates feels cautious and safe. Learn to feel the texture of each before you follow either. That is the capacity the Watch Council's counter protocols are designed to reinforce, not to make the interference disappear through external force alone, but to restore the field's own ability to read itself accurately enough to recognize when it has been touched. There is a final marker in this warning phase that the Watch Council considers the most urgent, because it is the one that most directly indicates how close the field is to the threshold where correction becomes significantly more resource-intensive. It is the moment when the disruptions begin to appear not just around movement, decision, or activation, but around rest, around recovery, around the moments when the field should be able to release the accumulated pressure of a difficult cycle and return to something closer to its baseline clarity, when sleep does not restore, when stillness feels more agitated than motion, when the moments that should offer relief instead seem to carry their own weight, a heaviness that follows the field into spaces that used to feel safe, into relationships that used to feel clear, into the quiet hours that used to feel like genuine reprieve. That is the Watch Council's most serious escalation marker. That is what they call threshold pressure. The interference has extended beyond the active areas of the field into the regenerative areas. It has followed the field into the spaces where the field would otherwise rebuild. And when regeneration is compromised, the field's ability to correct itself from within is directly impaired. It cannot heal the damage done during active cycles because the recovery cycles themselves are now under the same pressure. This is the architecture of deep interference. It does not simply press against the field while it moves. It pursues the field into stillness. It applies pressure in the margins and the quiet spaces so that the field never fully returns to a state from which it can accurately read its own situation. Each cycle begins slightly more depleted than the last. Each attempt at clarity is slightly more difficult than the one before it, and the field continues to explain this to itself in the language of ordinary exhaustion, because that is the only language it has had available. This is not the moment to become afraid. Fear is not the instruction, but it is the moment to become absolutely clear that this is not ordinary fatigue, that what feels like depletion may actually be a field under sustained interference at the precise points where it would otherwise be rebuilding its own clarity, its own signal strength, its own capacity to read the warnings accurately and respond to them with the full force of a field that has not been progressively drained. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not failing. You are a receiver frequency field in the middle of an interference pattern that was sophisticated enough to target your recovery capacity, which itself tells you something important about the nature of what has been operating against you. Ordinary disruption does not pursue the field into its recovery spaces. Structured interference does. And structured interference is precisely what the Watch Council has been monitoring, measuring, and now responding to with the deployment that was authorized for your field tonight. The Watch Council has already seen this, already measured it, already moved the counter protocols into position. That is not nothing. That is everything. That is the difference between a field that goes into the next cycle without any structured support and a field that goes into it with the Watch Council's seals already in place around the perimeter. The seals do not remove the interference through force alone. They create the structural conditions under which the field can begin recovering the interpretive capacity it needs to participate in its own correction. What you do with what you have received tonight determines how that seal sets. Clarity of recognition strengthens the seal. Continued dismissal of the signs weakens it. The Watch Council cannot hold the seal in place against a field that insists on reinterpreting the interference as ordinary noise, not because they lack the capacity, but because the seal requires the field's own recognition as part of its structural integrity. The seal is not applied to a passive surface. It is co-created between the Watch Council's protocols and the field's own act of naming what has been present. Recognition is not optional to the process. It is the process. This is why the alert was issued for this specific cycle, not to alarm you beyond usefulness, but to give your field the recognition it needed in order to become a coherent participant in its own protection. rather than a passive object of interference it could not see, could not name, and therefore could not refuse. Say it if it reaches you. I do not dismiss the signs. Let that land in the field. Let it settle below the surface of your ordinary awareness into the layer where the interference has been operating. Let the Watch Council's monitoring systems register that the recognition has been received, that the field has crossed from unknowing pressure into named awareness, and that the seal can now begin setting at the integrity level the deployment was designed to support. What keeps pressing against your life is no longer invisible. What has been accumulating in the field is no longer unnamed. The interference has lost the protection of your unawareness, and that loss is not minor. It is structural, and what you do with this recognition, in the next hours in the remaining window of this cycle, is the most consequential choice currently active in your field. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.